last week we started talking about
You got kicked out.
this issue. Yeah. Last week we started talking about the levels of discipline, understanding levels of discipline, and we really were working through this from the book of Proverbs, and you know, I like this approach because I really like to emphasize that you know we have to have more than one tool in our toolbox. We've got to think about discipline and parenting and raising children, or whether it's maybe, you know, even in the church context, think about discipling children. How do we help children in the church to grow? Maybe it's not our kids, maybe it's other people's kids that we're going to minister to in the church. So thinking about that, it's very important for us to understand the Bible does not see this as a one-size-fits-all. Here's your one tool, just do this and it works and it's done and everything works fine. No, there isn't anything like that. In fact, it's much more complex than that. And a lot of it, really, there's a lot of emphasis in the Bible on kind of the foundational teaching aspect. And that's a really big component that we've been trying to emphasize in our study. And so we talked about it. I'll just walk through them very quickly. Level 1, this is the most basic level of discipline. It's the lowest level. It's the thing that should occupy us most of the time, and that is encourage proper behavior. Right? A wise parent encourages a child to behave properly. So we tell the child what we want them to do, we instruct them, and we encourage them to do it. Second, level 2, inform of improper behavior. So a wise parent is proactive, and we address issues even before our child might be confronted by them. We warn them of what not to do, and we warn them about, you know, this is what I want you to do, I don't want you to do that. And we anticipate. Okay, again, as parents, as adults, we can anticipate things that kids can't, right? And this is true not just of little children, certainly, but it's also true of, you know, think about teenagers, right? And again, think about the teenagers here in the church and the kinds of challenges that they face. All of us who are adults were at one point teenagers. We all experienced those challenges. And as much as things are different today, they're also the same, right? Yes, there are some unique things and new things that didn't exist when we were teenagers. And yet, you know, human behavior, the sinful human heart, the tendencies, the desires, the temptations, they're all still the same. Sometimes they have new dressing, they come in new packaging, but the reality is the problems and the issues are still really the same. And so what does that mean? It means that, you know, you and I can see that sometimes. We know that, hey, this is where the danger lies for a teenager or a young person, right? A young child. And so we can help because we have that. We can say, hey, you know what? I'm just telling you right now, this is not the way to go. This is the bad way to go. Don't do that, okay? So we warn or we inform of improper behavior. Third, you explain the negative consequences of sin. Again, a wise parent points out the negative consequences of sin that lie along the path of life, right? Some of this you've learned by experience because you've had to deal with those consequences yourself. You've had to experience them. You've had to endure them. And so as a result, you know, hey, I don't want my kids to have to experience the same consequences of sin. So I'm going to warn them. I'm going to tell them what will happen if they choose this path, because I know where it leads. Okay? Maybe it's not personal experience. Maybe you just know because, again, you're older and you've had enough life experience to know you don't have to. That's one of the problems sometimes people run into. Is we have this idea that, well, what do you know? You haven't been through it. Well, you know what? I can learn a lot of things without having to go through all of it. Okay, I don't have to do everything there is to out there to know some things that are bad and they're going to have negative consequences. I can actually learn by watching other people, and I can see the things that happen. So, but that's something we can do. We can warn about what are the consequences. Okay, level 4, and these levels, I'm kind of describing them this way because they really are levels, right? We generally are going to stay on the lowest level possible. So that most of the time, we're simply going to be on level 1 and 2. We're going to be encouraging proper behavior and warning about improper behavior. That's the bulk of the time, okay? But then as we move up, right, what happens if it seems like maybe the child isn't listening? Maybe they're not understanding. Well, maybe I need to tell them, hey, if you decide to go down this road, here's some of the dangers that are lying in the path, okay? And then level 4, so now maybe maybe it's a little more serious situation. Maybe I see that their child is still tempted, or there still seems to be some issue here. Well, level 4, I gently exhort. Okay, and exhorting is, again, this is about advice. This is about encouraging. This is not hard in your face. This is those reminders where I'm saying, hey, don't forget to do this. Hey, remember this is important. And so I'm sharing these things. I'm exhorting. I'm encouraging my child. Maybe even I see them do something and I think, well, if this thing becomes a habit, it's going to be a problem. So I'm going to talk to them and I'm going to say, hey, this is not what you want to do, and I'm going to try and kind of exhort them. Level 5, again, maybe the child is in spite of my exhortation, in spite of the instruction, in spite of what I've taught them, I can see that they're beginning to choose the wrong thing. What do I do? Level 5, gently rebuke or reprove. Okay, we talked about this. A rebuke is a sharp word intended to get their attention, intended to maybe even startle them into realizing the danger of the situation they're in. And so I may have to do that, right? And a wise parent knows when to do this. It can't be all the time, but if I understand the situation is serious, in this moment I might be able to say a word that would get their attention. That's what I'm going to do. I want to confront them. I want to say, hey, you know this is wrong. Don't do that. Okay? And so that's a gentle rebuke or reprove. Okay? And one of the quotes that I have here is from this. I actually was using an article by Paul Wagner, which is really helpful on this. And he says, hopefully, if parents have done their job well up to this point, far less rebuking is necessary. So if I'm focusing on levels 1 through 4, hopefully I don't even have to do level 5 very much, because my kids are choosing the right thing, because I'm instructing them and I'm helping encourage them, and I've got this positive atmosphere where there's this positive pressure to encourage them to do the right thing. Okay? This is where we get to level 6, and this is where we stopped last time. Okay, so we're going to just come here. Corporal punishment that does not cause physical harm. Okay, a wise parent knows when to use corporal non-abusive punishment. Okay, we mentioned, let's look at these verses. If you could just look at the verses and help me out reading them, that would be great. Proverbs chapter 19. We read this one last week, but let's come back to it again. Proverbs 19 and verse 18. Maybe we weren't here last week, I think. Proverbs 19:18. Somebody have that? Want to read it for us? Phil? Okay.
Discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death.
Okay, discipline your son while there is hope, right? The idea is that there is a window of opportunity here, right? There is a time when there is still hope. That's the point of this. The mentality here is this is a hopeful action, right? So when we have to go as far as corporal punishment, physical punishment, think spanking or something like that. The purpose here is there's still hope. The hope is that I would turn my child back from the way of sin, turn them back from their stubborn, rebellious intention, right? That's the hope. Okay? But of course, this is the issue, right? If we don't do this, what does he say? He says, don't set your heart on his destruction. I think he's painting a pretty stark image here, right? If we don't engage in this kind of discipline in the appropriate circumstance, then what we're doing is we're setting our heart on his destruction. Right? So I think there's some implications here. One of the implications is that that this kind of discipline, this kind of corporal punishment, it does not show a lack of love for our children. Actually, neglecting it shows a lack of love for our children. If I refuse to do this, I'm actually showing a lack of love for my children, because I'm setting my heart on their destruction. Okay, I'm abandoning them to that result. Okay, so I think that's one of the implications here. The other, and this is a point I was doing some reading today on this, and the other point that I thought was interesting is about this is that corporal punishment, spanking or whatever means we're talking about here, is not for the benefit of me as the parent. Right? It's not because I need to have peace and order in my home. It's not because I can't handle this anymore, and so now I have to do something about it. That's not the purpose of this. This is actually directed toward my child, right? This is directed toward the child. That's the whole point here, right? Chasten your son while there is hope, and don't set your heart on his destruction. The whole focus is on the child, okay? This is for his benefit. That's why, as a parent, I am to do this, because it's for his benefit. So here's what Wegner says about that. I don't know if I put this in your notes. Did I give you any quotes here or not? I can't remember.
Discipline is hard work.
Is there one there? I can't see. Okay. He says this: the main intent appears to be that temporary punishment is better than allowing wickedness or evil to run wild and lead to more serious punishment. Okay? So I'm going to bring punishment, physical punishment, into my child's life right now with the hope that it prevents this from getting worse, right? Because if I don't deal with it now, it's going to get worse, and then the punishment's going to be worse. Okay? So that's, I think, significant. So then Wegner says this: the wise parent uses only the level of discipline necessary to curb the incorrect behavior. If my goal is to turn my child back from this stubborn rebellion and get them to stop going down that path, then I'm going to stop as soon as there is a giving up. As soon as my child stops going that way, stops rebelling, stops stiffening their neck, stops resisting what's right, well, as soon as there's a surrender, then this can stop, right? Immediately. The other thing here, too, to understand, this is not about, it's really not about punishment. I don't like the word punishment here. I use it in the notes, but it's not really my favorite term here, because that almost implies, well, you did the crime, now you got to do the time, as if that's the cost, right? You did that, now you're going to just get stuck in this. But actually, the purpose, as we're reading this verse here in Proverbs 19:18, is the idea is I'm trying to get a certain response. I'm trying to get something to happen with my child. When that thing happens, now I don't have to keep doing this anymore. I don't have to keep doing it. It's not like, okay, now I'm sentencing you to the next whatever. No, because I'm looking to try to prompt this change in your behavior, this change in your attitude. I'm looking to see you give in, because now you submit. And once you do that, okay, it's done. Okay, and at that point, we don't have to continue on this anymore, right? Let's keep going. Let's look at Proverbs 13, verse 24. Proverbs 13, verse 24.
He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly.
Okay. Again, we've already kind of said this, but exercising corporal punishment here is not unloving. It's actually a loving action. It's the one who refuses to do this that is demonstrating a lack of love, Solomon says. And I think that word promptly is kind of important too, right? Paulette and I had a conversation yesterday in the car about people using the phrase or the language of it's not good for my mental health. It's kind of an excuse to just not do something they don't want to do. They're like, oh, it's not good for my mental health. And I'm like, okay, there's lots of things that aren't good for mental health, but I have to do them anyways, because it's just life. That's like being a parent, being an adult. You just do what you have to do sometimes. And I'm like, sometimes survival is not, like, I would love a mental health break. It doesn't, I told her, when we were kids, we used to read the Reader's Digest, and they would have the drama in real life. Anybody remember that section? That was my favorite section. Other than the jokes. The jokes were always great. But then the drama in real life, and you read these stories of people who survived, like, horrific circumstances. How did they survive? Well, they didn't have a timeout in the middle for a mental health break. They just endured and did what they had to do because that was the only way they could make it. And it's like, I don't know, I was like, oh, it seems to me like a lot of people today wouldn't survive some of those things. And I don't, that's probably not fair, really, but to me, it just seems like a cop-out sometimes, especially as a parent. Listen, I don't have to like it. I don't have to, but Solomon says here, the one who loves him disciplines him promptly. That means I set aside what I want. I set aside what's comfortable and convenient for me. And no, I have to get up and, that means when I'm tired and I don't really want to do it, I gotta get up off the couch and do it. I have to do that because I love my child, right? Yeah.
And related to that is wait until your dad gets home. That by the time dad gets home, the behavior's done and gone, and it doesn't make the association that if you do it right away.
Right, I think especially when they're young. I think as they get older, there's more of, we're gonna talk about this more. Yeah. Okay? Because we're not done yet. Like we may have talked about it, but we need to address this, and it's a big deal. That kind of thing might be, hey, when your dad gets home, we're gonna talk about this more because this is serious and we're gonna talk about it. But that's for an older child, especially for a younger child. I agree. Yeah, this should be dealt with, right? And again, the whole point here is we're not talking about some long drawn out. You're not going to go in the penalty box. You're not going to go away for 5 years. We're just going to deal with this issue right now, and we're looking for this child to respond rightly here, right? We're trying to get this child to respond, and so yeah, you can't drag that out. You can't be okay. Well, let's delay. Let's do it. No, we need to deal with it promptly, and I think that is a good thing.
And
yeah.
The creating a sense of dread and building it up and making the punishment bigger and bigger, it kind of defeats the purpose, because then the kid is focused on that bad thing happening and they've forgotten about what caused it, and now it's just creating a rift in the relationship instead of.
Well, and I think, again, I think there is some of that, right? For an example, like if I'm dealing with one of my kids and I say, listen, go to your room, I will be there, right? And they go, usually it's because I'm like, I need a minute, okay? And you need a minute, but I'm coming in there and we're gonna talk, and then there's gonna be we're gonna deal with this issue, right? That probably creates enough of that in them, right? Because they know that I'm going to come in there and we're going to deal with this. But yeah, no reason to drag this out unnecessarily. And again, I think this is important. This is why I don't like to use idea of punishment, because there almost has that sense of like psychological torture, right? Where I just send them out and make them really, really, they're going to rue the day they did this, or something like that. It's, well, that attitude is not the biblical mindset here at all. Okay? Notice that this is all about loving your child. Okay, that's the context here. It's about loving your child, not hating them. Well, that implies this is not me out to just say, well, you know what, I'm sick and tired of you doing that, and I'm going to make sure you feel it. Like, that's not the attitude that is described here at all. Right? That's not a biblical attitude toward dealing with the discipline with our children. Okay, I'm fed up, and no, that's not the attitude that's described here at all. The attitude is, I love you, and I'm motivated by my love for you to intervene in the circumstance. I can't let you keep doing what you're doing. Okay, now you're hitting your sister. I can't let you do that. That's not. Because I love you too much to let you think that kind of behavior is okay. So I'm going to swoop in and I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to deal with it. And it may be really inconvenient for me right now to do that. But because I love you, I'm going to do it. I mean, I'm probably not going to say all those things. Okay? But that's the attitude. That's the heart. And again, that's what we're looking for. That's the idea. That's what we need to be cultivating here. And we need to strive for that, because that's what Solomon is describing. So this is not some sort of like, I want to make sure he really, really feels it. I want to make sure to drag this out. No, that's just torture. That's not what this is. Okay, that is very much a worldly way to deal with things. It's not a biblical way. And so I think that's why we're supposed to deal with it quickly. So we're not dragging this out, and we're not, manipulating this. It's just, hey, this is the problem, and I remember this from when I was in college, and I remember Dr. Brock, the older Dr. Brock. I remember him talking about this issue of and he was explaining, you know, when he, in his opinion, and you know, his wisdom of Scripture, when to apply spanking, right, as a tool. And he said it's reserved for times of defiance and rebellion, right? The child is actively defying me. I am now forced to deal with that defiance until the child stops defying, right? And that's the point here. I can't allow the defiance to continue. I can't allow rebellion. I can't allow this kind of attitude to just go unchecked. But that's the purpose of that tool, like to help to stop that. This is not like, again, it's not some ongoing punishment. And that's why I think we have to have that mindset. And I think that's the biblical mindset here. Okay? Let's go to Proverbs 23 then. This is a couple controversial verses here. Proverbs 23, 13, and 14. I actually have a whole article to look at with respect to these verses, which we may or may not get to. We'll see about tonight, but because it's interesting. Michael, 13 and 14.
Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell.
Okay. Yeah. You can right? You can beat him and it won't die.
I haven't yet.
Well, again, yeah, we'll deal with this verse a little bit more in some detail later, I think. But a couple things that are just important to notice here is that this is not intended to cause harm. That's the whole point here, right? The whole purpose is this is not causing harm. This is not causing death. This is not a parent just, you know, word's not coming to my mind here. This is not a parent just venting all their frustration on the kid. That's not what he's talking about. Okay? But again, the problem is that we as parents might withhold this. These parents might not do this. We might not actually engage in disciplining our child. Okay? And Solomon says, listen, you need to do this. Here's what Wagner says about this verse. He says, notice that even the rod of discipline should not do irreparable harm to the child. That's the implication, he says, is that it should not be used in an abusive or harmful way, including being used in anger or out of meanness. That is not what he's talking about. It's not what we should do. Severe misbehavior warrants severe consequences, particularly if there's a pattern of serious sin. That's the point of this. That's what we're trying to address. Okay. When he talks about delivering his soul from hell, I think it's important to note what he means by that, because he's talking here about, you know, hell is the word Sheol, and the New King James gives that as a note there. Sheol means the grave, the afterlife, right? Saying that left unchecked, what happens to the rebellious and disobedient child? Left unchecked, death. Right? That's actually, we'll get to that. That's level 7 and 8 here. We're coming to that, okay? So we'll come back to that in just a minute. How about Proverbs 29 and verse 15? Proverbs 29 is verse 15. Read that one, please. Sam?
The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother.
Wagner says this, and I think he's just right on the money. He says, discipline is hard work. It's much easier to let children have their own way and wander off into sin. But parents who love their children will not allow this to happen. By the way, I think that's actually the implication, meaning of Proverbs 22:6. You're familiar with that verse. It's often translated, you know, the train up a child in the way he should go when he's old and not depart from it. But I think Dan Phillips, who's a pastor down in Texas, makes a really, really compelling argument that that's not what that verse means. What that verse means is, if you let a child have his way, when he's old, he won't vary from it. If you just let a child have his own way, you don't confront him, you don't contradict him, you don't force him to listen and obey and submit, well, then you'll never get him. And that's what he's saying here, right? The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but if a child is left to himself, right? Just let the child have his own way. It's like letting a horse have his own lead. Well, that might work once in a while, but the reality is, that isn't probably gonna get you where you want to go.
Well, you see that all the time right now.
Absolutely.
See it with the children that are in the courtrooms on the television, and their parents are like, I can't believe this happened. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, why can't you? You let them do this, 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 and this.
Sure.
And you didn't
Sure,
pay
if we
any
let the
attention
child
to 'em.
become the criminal in the home, and by
Right.
that I mean, we let them defy the rule, we let them do what they want, we let them have, no boundaries, well then, why are we surprised when they take that and translate that into society? Okay? And that's the issue here, right? He says this is shameful, this brings shame to the mother because she has a child now who publicly is known as being incorrigible, but that's because they didn't give rod and rebuke to give wisdom when the child was younger. Okay? So I think that's what Wagner's saying. It's easy to sit and say, well, I'm just too tired. Oh, I've got too much going on, or whatever, and not deal with it. But the reality is, if I love my child, I can't allow it to happen. And so I have to deal with it. I have to be engaged in trying to discipline my child. Okay? Let's look at the next, just so I want to try to finish this up tonight. But level 7, corporal punishment that causes physical harm. And you say, wait a second, why are we talking about that? Well, here, the book of Proverbs does not suggest that parents use this technique. Okay, this is not something that's given to parents. But Proverbs does indicate that serious sin can lead to serious punishment. This is not something that's in the realm of parents' authority, right? We are not given the authority to actually cause physical harm to our children. But that doesn't mean that that's not a level of discipline. It just says discipline's out of our hands. Okay? So look at a couple of examples. Proverbs 20 and verse 30. And then we got Proverbs 10:31.
Blows that hurt cleanse away evil, as do stripes the inner depths of the heart.
Okay, blows that hurt, that's one thing, but stripes, think about Isaiah 53, by his stripes we're healed. When you think about Jesus, what did Jesus endure? This stripes here is not talking about parental discipline. This is talking about something much more severe than that. Something that's clearly leaving marks. In fact, it's doing significant physical damage. Okay? And of course, we in the United States, we don't have that per se as a I remember back in what year? Well, I don't remember when it was probably in the 90s. I remember there was an American over in like Singapore that got caned. Do you remember that? I forget the story, and it was a huge outcry. But he'd broken the law in Singapore, and that was, I think it was Singapore, and that was the punishment for breaking the law, was he was gonna get caned. And people in America were all up in arms about it. And it's like, well, yeah, we don't do that here, but there are still other places in the world where that kind of punishment is a legal punishment for certain crimes. Well, if your child does those kind of things that deserve those, that call for those kind of punishments, guess what's going to happen to them? Right? So again, this is not something you and I are doing. We're not going to do that, but the government might, and society might do that to them, right? Or even maybe in a less formal way, right? If your child doesn't learn not to mouth off to you, what happens when they mouth off to the gang of 1% bikers that are riding by, and whatever, right? They're going to get a taste of it, right? If they mouth off to the wrong person. And so you can help prevent that. Why? By using the lower levels of discipline, we can teach our children, and we can help them to understand that there are boundaries. There are, control your tongue, those kind of things. And so that's some of the implications here. Okay, let's look at chapter 10, verse 31. Proverbs 10:31. Michael?
The mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut out.
Well, that's a pretty significant level of discipline for a perverse tongue, right? Not something that parents are to administer, not something that we are to, but it's, again, the issue here is there are still higher things, more severe things that can happen if those things are done. So Wagner says the verse, and we're talking about this verse that Michael just read, the verse does not say who is to administer the judgment, but this type of severe punishment in most societies is outside the authority of the parent to administer. But again, there are other, especially not, again, not so much in America. We don't really do those kind of punishments anymore. I suppose maybe there was a time when we did. I don't know. But we don't do that anymore. But it's still the case in some places in the world. And again, it may not be the government inflicting it. Maybe somebody else who just has the power to do it, and you get yourself mixed up with the wrong person. You say or do the wrong thing, and there you go. There's very severe consequences. And so that is a level of discipline beyond parental discipline, but still there. And then the last level, level 8, is death. Right? Book of Proverbs also does not include this in the realm of parental discipline. Sorry. So when Bill Cosby said, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. That's not legit. Okay. Parents don't have the right to do that. Obviously, we understand that. But again, this is the realm of consequences that are meted out by government. Right? I mean, you read Romans 13, what does Paul say? That the government does not bear the sword in vain. The implication is what? That the government has the right, in some cases, to exercise even capital punishment. Okay? So that is a consequence for sinful behavior. And it's actually a consequence that's sanctioned by God for governments to do. Let's look at a couple of examples. One is really one from Proverbs and then one from Deuteronomy. Proverbs 19, verses 18 and 29. Who's got that one? I guess we already read that. We already read 18. Let's do 29. Because 18 talked about the judgment, the destruction of our,
29 says, condemnation is ready for scoffers, and beating for the backs of fools.
Okay, condemnation, right? That's a judgment of execution, right? And so, again, this is the realm of the consequences that government metes out. Deuteronomy 21, we have there in Israel, right? The instructions for how Israel was to practice their capital punishment, right? At least in one case here. It's not the only case, but Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 21. Says here, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them. So notice how there's a progression here, right? The parents have given instruction, right? He won't listen to the voice of his mother or father. So there's voice, there's instruction, there's verbal correction, they've chastened him, so they have engaged in physical, corporal punishment, and he is still not listening, will not heed them. Then his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the city, to the gate of the city, and they shall say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. By the way, that is important to understand. Sometimes people just read the first part of that verse, don't read the whole verse. We're not talking about a toddler who's throwing a tantrum here. Okay, we're not even talking about a teenager who's being a handful and difficult to deal with. This is a stubborn and rebellious son who is a glutton and a drunkard. Okay, somebody who is completely living a profligate life and refuses to listen to his parents at all, and just is absolutely right. He's one of the children of Israel. He's in the covenant people, and yet he is living in this rebellious, sinful, wicked life. Okay. Verse 21, then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away all the evil from among you, and all Israel shall fear and fear. Okay. So again, the implication being that there are some things for which government has the right and responsibility to exercise capital punishment. And in this case, it's connected actually to, it's the levels of discipline beyond parental discipline. Parents can't, parents have tried this and go, the child is still stubborn, still refusing to listen. At some point now, it moves out of the parents' hands and it moves into the hands of society to deal with, okay? And so again, we see that happen here today as well. We see, someone who is just absolutely defiant and refuses to respond, say, to a legal, legitimate request by an officer of the law and refuses to comply. And what happens? Well, that ramps up the level of confrontation, and if it just continues, it can become lethal, can't it? And we see that happen. We see it on the news. We see it happen all the time. Somebody refuses to comply with the officer's instructions and ends up dead. Right? Because why? Because he kept going past the point of these other levels of discipline until the only thing left, the only thing that would stop him was lethal force. Okay? And again, those are unfortunate and sometimes unjustified in those cases. And that, we have a system to try to hopefully try to identify that. But unfortunately, it sometimes is necessary. It's the only thing left. Okay, and that's, I think, biblical. So Wagner says this: with our sinful nature, we'll push the boundaries as far as possible for as long as we can get away with it. As a result, God initiated capital punishment in Genesis 9:6 as a societal response for certain behaviors. And he says this as well. He says, a stubborn and rebellious son will not be a productive moral member of society. So if we won't deal with our children, if we won't discipline them, they're not going to become moral and productive members of society, because they're learning from us that they don't have to listen, they don't have to obey, they don't have to comply, they don't have to respect authority. And then they go out into the rest of the world, and what do? They just do what they've learned to do. And so this is why we as parents need to engage in the first 6 levels of discipline and use those tools all along the way, right? So that our children can learn to respect authority, learn to submit to authority that is biblical and right. Okay. All right, any questions or thoughts on that at this point? Haven't really talked the practical stuff about how and some of the implications. We'll get to some of that. I've got some other. One question I was going to ask you guys to think about, and so we've got just a couple minutes left. What about the "I told you so," or because I told you so, because I said so? Is that what are your thoughts on that as a legitimate or illegitimate basis for your children's obedience? Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind is the verse that says fathers shouldn't provoke their children to anger, I think
Okay.
is what it was.
Ephesians 6:4. Yep.
If you can avoid giving that sort of an answer when your kid's just getting frustrated, I think it makes sense to avoid giving that
Okay.
answer as much as possible.
Sure. I think we need to be cautious with that. Sure.
Depends on how urgent the,
Yeah.
it's like, hey, there's a car coming, move off the road, I'm not gonna stop and try to explain it.
Right.
Get off the road.
Right.
Okay, when you get off the road.
Right. I completely agree, and I think you're both of you are absolutely right. Okay.
Because it's not a reason.
Okay, that's true. But here's the question: is it legitimate for a parent to say, the reason you're going to do this is because I said so? Yeah.
I think so.
It is. And sometimes people will say, well, we don't want our kids, we want our kids to think for themselves. We don't want them just to blindly follow authority. And that's true. We don't want our kids to just blindly follow authority, right? They don't get to the excuse of and this is the extreme. They don't get the excuse of the Nazis saying, well, I'm just following orders. When I say usher these people into the gas chamber. No, that's not legitimate, right? You don't just follow orders. But, right, they're not just following orders. They're not just following anybody. I'm their father, right? Or their mother. I've been given this authority by God. And so there are times, as Sam said, I think there are times where I might just say, because I'm the dad and I say that's what you're going to do. Okay? I agree that we need to be careful. That shouldn't be all the time. And when it is appropriate and when we can, we should explain to our children. We should try to help them to understand why. Sometimes, though, maybe even times when we don't have to, it's still not a bad thing for us sometimes to say, because I am the parent, I'm going to make the decision here. And you just need to obey and trust God and trust me that this is right. Okay? And so, yeah, thoughts?
Multiple times lately, when Gavin has asked a question about why do I have to or whatever, I've said, you're allowed to ask that question and I will answer it eventually, but right now I just need this to happen.
Good.
So I like him to understand that he's allowed to ask questions, and I want to give him a rational answer, but still establishing.
Right. And again, and sometimes just in that circumstance, I don't have the time right now. We can't take the time to have this conversation, but again, I'm willing to explain that to you. We'll talk about that later. I think that's appropriate, and that's good. It's good for us to do that. It helps, like you said, we want to affirm with our children. Ask questions, please. You're free to ask questions. One of the things Michael wrote up a while back, a children's bill of, was it Bill of Rights? What did you write about? Wasn't it Bill of Rights? Something like
Oh,
that.
it was our,
I forget what you
forget
call
what I
it.
called it.
It's posted by
It
the
was
door
a
of our
family
kitchen.
thing, not just.
But it actually was interesting because I had been talking to my dad about this around the same time, and I don't know what made him think about that or whatever, but I remember talking about that. That I think it's good for the kids to know that they have some in our home. Here's the rights. Here's when you can ask the questions. Okay, and it's okay if you ask the question as long as you are respectful in asking and in receiving the response, because it might not be the response you want. I'm not under any obligation to give you the response you want or to explain it to your satisfaction, right? But you're free to ask the questions. We want to encourage that. So there was something, and he wrote it up, and I keep meaning to sit down with the kids and kind of go through it and say, I think there's some really good points here, and let's remind them that, yeah, you do have the freedom to do this. You have the freedom to come back and say, well, what about this? As long as you're respectful, and as long as there's time for us to talk about it, then sure, yeah, we can consider other options.